Hello, thank you, Ellen, for joining us under these extraordinary and unprecedented circumstances. Welcome to Albert Park College. In the broadest of strokes, why don't you tell the audience a bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Lily. Thank you. So I am a Malanjali person from Southeast Queensland, and I'm currently on Yagara and Turrbal country. So I pay my respects to this country and elders past, present, and future. And I have been living here since I was born and have been writing and working for maybe the last 10 years. And I've written 3 books, a fiction collection called Heat and Light, and 2 poetry books called Comfort Food and Throat, which just came out in March this year.
Amazing, thank you. I was recently, in unprecedented times, recently reading your essay that you published, Virus in a Scorched Land. And it's quite an amazing essay on the realities of and implications of this virus on our Indigenous communities on top of an already absolutely devastating fire season, and where the government and wider Australian communities are falling short in adequately supporting our Indigenous communities. I would just like to say I'm really sorry for the loss of your sacred macadamia trees to your specific community, the Yugambeh people. And I just want to acknowledge, how does your connection to land and country influence your life and relationship to storytelling?
Thank you, Lily. Really, really tough. Like, it's been what a year it's been with the fires at the beginning of the year. And so when I was asked by the University of Venice to write about what it's like, because it was four different essays from 4 different continents, and so I was sort of the Australian representative, I guess. And you can read the essay online. It's called Virus in a Scorched Land. I really wanted to talk about how we, we're in this COVID situation, but we're also really, the fires was such a big part of this year and continue to be just that continuing devastation, and how important it is that we learn from it, I guess. And I know that there's also fires happening in California at the moment. I read this really good article about how the Native people there are wanting to continue their burning practices that they've been doing for thousands of years, but has been disrupted. And we just know that if countries burn properly before the fire season, we're not going to have these massive events that we have. That's unfortunately affected us all, I think, no matter where we live. And we had the fires in Queensland, but not as bad as South Coast and Victoria. But still, every tree and every animal is sacred, and we really need to just kind of take a moment to think about that loss, I think, because we're so quick as a society, as a broader society, to be oh, the next thing is COVID, and let's talk about COVID. We're not, recognizing that we can talk about climate change, and we can talk about this virus, and we can talk about Black Lives Matter, just all together as part of, this very interlinked, I think. So, thank you. I think I forgot your question.
No problem. How does connection to land and country influence your relationship to storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was just so much in what you said that I wanted to expand on that. So, being here from Southeast Queensland, I'm so plugged in. This is really not only where I grew up, but also where my ancestors are from and have been for thousands of years. So there's just a lot of story here, and a lot of things that I'm still like talking to elders and finding out things that I didn't know. And so recently I sat down and spoke to an elder just last weekend, and she told me this story about a mission on Minjirribah, which is just off the coast from here, so very close to Mianjin and Britzman. And I was so compelled by that story, I wanted to write it down, and I really felt it, and I really kind of felt it in my body. And I think it was from being there, like being there where it happened. And so I think like my writing is kind of a very metaphysical thing that comes from having that connection to country and to this, beautiful community that I'm part of in Queensland.
Yeah. I guess going off what you were saying earlier, you were talking about, like, I guess, the intersectionality between a lot of issues. I noticed that a lot with throat. You divide it into 5 kind of sections to do with whiteness and Aboriginal culture and queer identity and many things like that. So was that something you had planned from the outset to kind of, say this intersectional approach to it, or was that just something that emerged naturally?
Yeah, thanks, Daddy. I kind of a bit of both. Like, I was writing these poems, and the thing about writing a poetry collection, having written 2 poetry collections, often it's coming from a central idea. So the first book, Comfort Food, was about food, but it wasn't really about food, like in terms of like a literal kind of thing. Like it was like bouncing off what food means to us. Like it's like belonging, family, culture, community and stuff. And then with this new book, I was like, I came up with that title, Throat, pretty soon after I started writing these poems. And the idea of throat is like about, like when you feel like you've got something stuck in your throat and you can't talk or you can't do anything. It's sort of like about, that kind of overcoming that and like being able to like speak freely. And so I knew I had that title, and then I started writing all of these poems, which were about other themes, as you mentioned, but still relating to that, the idea of having something stuck in your throat. So I was talking about racism, I was talking about language, and talking about sexuality and gender. And then I thought, how am I going to present this? Like you have like, I had like 100 poems and not all of them are finished or good. So I don't publish everything I write. So like I'd curated, a list of like, these poems I want to publish these. And it was like something like 60 poems. And I'm like, well, how am I going to like create a journey for the reader when they read this? And I thought, actually, I think the sections are going to work. So you enter it and you kind of know what I'm talking about. And I wrote a series of poems in that whiteness section, as you mentioned, that were when I was in Europe. I was in Germany, teaching in Germany for about 3 or 4 months, and I had some really good conversations, and actually like walked into a forest, the Black Forest in Germany, and people were telling me, these are the trees that were used for, they use these types of trees to make the boats that then came to colonize countries. And I thought, wow, it's so interesting. Like I mentioned before that I'm a place person. So I was like, I am so swept up in being in this forest that, is on the other side of the world, but has this connection, and that connection is colonization. And so I wanted to kind of write about that from these different angles. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to put all of these Europe poems together and put that in that section. And so you sort of get a bit of a journey throughout the collection.
Yeah, funny you should mention that specific poem. Ship-shaped hole in a forest is my favorite from the collection.
Oh, cool.
It's fantastic.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess from that, your poems seem to be incredibly personal. Did you find that any specific poems were harder to write than others?
Yeah, what a great question. Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of poems that are really personal, and it involves a negotiation with, if I'm like writing about people in my life, I need to talk to them about it. And also thinking about like, do I really want this out there? Like, I feel really vulnerable, and wondering like whether, it serves a purpose, like it has to kind of serve a purpose. So a couple of examples, there's a couple of poems about my mum and my aunties, and about like my nana who passed away when I was, quite young, maybe 11 years old. And a lot of those poems emerged from, conversations that I had with my mum and aunties. And it was kind of like, it wasn't just me writing it, they were writing it as well. And so, I was like, what do you guys think? Like, should this be part of the book? And they were like, yeah, no, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful that you're like creating that tribute to your grandmother. And, they liked it. So that was good. Then there was another poem that I wrote, actually two examples. Some poems I wrote about like my suffering, like depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts, and had a kind of really rough time a couple of years ago with my depression. And I was like, do I include those poems? Like, wow, like, should I do that? And, like they were really written at the time when I was like experiencing this. And I still, definitely experienced depression and anxiety on a day-to-day basis, but it was very pronounced during that time. And I was like, you know what, I am going to include this because, I think obviously a lot of people can relate to this, and it fits in what I'm saying. And the final piece that I wanted to talk about is a piece called Four Truths and a Treaty. And in that piece, I talk about lateral violence, which for those of you who don't know is kind of like when people in a community start kind of perpetuating violence on each other. So like say the queer community, like start like saying, you're not queer enough, or you're not, things that start getting fractured. And in terms of like my community, people can often sort of say, no, you might have lighter skin, so you're not Aboriginal enough. That then perpetuates the wider assumptions of us that non-Indigenous people potentially are thinking about us. And so, it really arises from threats that come from outside of the community, but then kind of sink into your skin, and then you sort of start bullying each other and saying, pulling apart each other's differences, I guess. And so I was like, I really want to write about this, but I don't know how people are going to like take it, but the response has been really good. And also just, so I was like, because I see people like attacking each other on social media all the time, and I'm like, no, like, it's not good. It stresses me out. It really stresses me out, because that's what they want. They want our communities to be fractured. Like, that just serves like the alt-right purpose to like divide us and like say, so I think like and social media is not potentially the best place to be having those conversations anyway. So I think I just like really wanted to talk about that and get it on the table, and people might disagree with me, agree with me, whatever, but like, yeah, like, so I just was like, I did it, and now I feel good. I feel good that I did it. So yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because it is so deeply personal and really a difficult conversation you first have to have with yourself. Like, I really respect you being willing to share that with other people. And I just wanted to touch on the idea of resilience that you talked about in your essay, how that influences Indigenous communities and white communities' perception of Aboriginal culture. And what conversations were you having with your mum to come upon like this idea of resilience?
Yeah, I was talking to mum, and I think I mentioned the word resilience. I was like, Mum, I don't like the word resilience. And she was like, what's this resilience word? Is this, oh, she was like, is it, she said resilience? And I was like, actually, you're right. It kind of, it could be resilience, could be resilience. And I'll explain a little bit. So often, Indigenous communities and diverse communities are said, you're so resilient, you've gone through this, you've gone through that, you're so resilient. That then gives those institutions and the colonial machine kind of a free pass, because when you focus on the individual as being resilient and being able to get through this and this and this, you then don't think about how institutions are creating this environment where we have to be resilient, like so I really wanted to mention that. And like things like being in the southeast, the colonization was really quick, really rapid. Places like Sydney, Melbourne, 90% of the population were killed over a very short amount of time through violence and through disease, like smallpox. And then people were very quickly taken away from their land and forced to no longer practice culture or language. And so you can think about my community as now being in a process of language revival, Yugambeh language being started to be spoken in schools and taught and everything. You can see that as being resilient, that we've managed to survive all of these practices of violence and assimilation, and still like have like young kids like 5 years old like being like proud to be Yugambeh and speak Yugambeh and like continue that. But then if you keep focusing on us as being like as exceptional as we are, then you're sort of getting away from like all the other stuff that's continual, because it is continual. Like I think very recently, maybe like 3 years ago, an Aboriginal woman was told that she couldn't speak her language in Parliament. So we still are having those kind of barriers. And I think we need to kind of think about it in those different ways, I think.
And it's such a relevant conversation now, especially I'm so grateful for the Black Lives Matter movement translating to something not different, but relevant to Australia, and just the idea of so many, especially queer communities, like religious minorities or immigrant minorities, having, oh, but you're so strong. It's, I don't want to have to be strong in many ways. So I feel I should be allowed to feel vulnerable. And I was watching something about a Black woman talking about, I don't want to be the strong Black woman. I want to be able to be vulnerable, and that is okay. And I feel like that's a really important conversation, because I don't need to be strong all the time, because no one is strong all the time.
100%.
Yeah, it reminds me of I was hearing a disabled person talking about how they don't like being called a hero, and they don't like being called resilient, because it's just a constant reminder that everyone else sees their life as hell when they don't see their life that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's just like pointing out that, totally. Yeah.
I read Comfort Food as well. I really, really enjoyed it. And I loved mango in particular. I feel like that's been quite contentious because it was one implemented into the Queensland curriculum.
New South Wales.
And I was absolutely dumbfounded at the response to it being so negative, even though it's an amazing, Comfort Food is an amazing collection of work, and Mango is an amazing poem to analyse, but there is such a stigma around Indigenous people and the queer community sharing art. And there was such an awful response that I felt so terrible to be in a generation of people that responded that way. And I just wanted to say, I appreciated that work so much, and just wanted to ask, like, how did that structure, that really non-linear, almost feels like you're walking through quite a distant memory, how does structure influence your poems? In particular, great structure before poem or poem. And then
thank you so much, Lily, because I like, even though that what happened with that poem being selected, and then sort of having a lot of kind of negative, lots of like comments from a very select group of year 12s in that particular year. The amount of like positive kind of stuff that has like young people like reaching out to me in a positive way has like overtaken that kind of, that negative experience. And like I've had so many people like your age like tell me that they like my work, which is so cool for me, like so cool. I think I wrote about that incident in the first poem of my book, Throat. Like I just like wanted to like, just like kind of get it out of the way. Because at the time people were asking me to talk about it publicly, and I didn't want to because I really didn't understand it actually, because I'm quite a private person. I'm not public on social media or anything. But one day I woke up and I just had thousands of emails and thousands of like private Facebook messages. Even though my Facebook account was private, people could still message me. And I just really didn't know what was happening. Those messages some of them were from high schoolers, but a lot of them were from trolls, just people that were just like piling on. And so I really don't necessarily think the response was about the poem at all. Like it was about something else. And I just happened to be the target of the week, you know what I mean? So I just sort of, just like kind of just rolled with it. And I wrote that poem that appears in the first poem of the book. I wrote that very soon after what happened, and I was just like in just like a weird state, because actually it brought back a lot of memories for me, and that's why it's called Memories Sometimes Coming Backwards, sometimes Walking Backwards, because I was sort of in this weird moment where I was experiencing the past and the present at the same time. And actually, one thing that really broke me was I got a message from someone I used to go to high school with, and they said, I saw what happened and I just wanted to say sorry for like the bullying that happened to you at school. And I was like, oh, whoa, like that's like going back, 10 years, 15 years. And just like for me to link those two things together was like pretty, like, I was like, whoa, didn't expect to go there, so I think, just like being able to like realize that so many people experience this, like targeted trolls, bullying online, and just how it's not just the incident itself, it's sometimes the things around the incident that can really affect you. And so, yeah, I just wanted to write about that very much from being in the moment of when that happened. Mm.
Thank you.
Oh, go on.
No, you go. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask, do you think your works have a target audience, I guess, going on from that? Like, are you trying to speak to specific people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely it's like I see my work as being able to be read for a general audience. So it doesn't really matter like how old you are. And so I have like 9-year-olds like read my work and send me comments. And then I have like young people, and like my youngest fan so far is like this 3-year-old who, like, I did like a thing like where I read children's books on it's called Storybox Library, and apparently this like little girl, she can only go to sleep like listening to like hearing me like read this kid's book.
It's adorable.
And so like that's really beautiful for me, like. And to have my works that are not necessarily, Throat wasn't necessarily written for like high school age, but to have that crossover, to be able to be read by adults and by like high schoolers, and it's just really cool for me. And I don't necessarily write for a particular like white or black or audience. I just like I write from that kind of experience of someone that's been on the outside. And I think that can connect to a lot of people that might not necessarily be First Nations, but like they've had those experiences in different ways. So I think it's really cool. Yeah. And I like the interesting thing is like recently I've been thinking about writing for, because young adult fiction is kind of a marketing term anyway. It's not like people use that term to put your books in a certain kind of area in the shelf. And I'm sure you guys read across things, like you might not necessarily read young adult fiction, you might pick up an adult fiction book or what's seen as an adult fiction book, or whatever. But recently I've been thinking about writing specifically for a YA audience, like for you guys. And I'm like, do I like change the way that I write and think, or does it just happen naturally? And I don't want to like feel like I know what you guys are going to like, because like I'm just going to like hopefully just write a good story and you're going to enjoy it. But I definitely don't want to like be patronizing and be like, those 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, they would really benefit from this story. I have to write this. Like, I don't want to be like that. I just want to like write something and hopefully you guys like it, Yeah.
I just thinking about work itself, it's not always for someone else. And I feel like poetry is a conversation with yourself. How would you relate to that?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of my work is like, just like figuring things out, and I happen to do it on the page, and just like that's my best way of communication, I think.
I guess to change track a little bit, do you say what would you say the main influences on your poetic style are, and also literary style?
Yeah, I think I really am influenced by people like Maxine Benova Clark, who writes across forms. I really like her work. I really like lots of like work coming out from America, like writers like Jericho Brown, who's a queer Black poet from America. Really like his work. Really just very influenced by contemporary poetry. Don't necessarily read stuff that's like I really read stuff that's like in this present time, in this moment. How are people making sense of the world? But every now and again, I go back and I read a poetry book that was published, like 50 years ago, like Ujuru New Knuckles' book, which I just picked up, called My People. And I was like, wow, she is writing about things that still are very relevant today. Like, wow. So I think it's important to do that as well. But yeah, very much into like queer poetry. And poetry like written by like minorities and First Nations voices, and just anything that's kind of a bit edgy or doing something differently or potentially like playing with form. I'm like really into kind of language play as well. And I can read stuff that's like bilingual or like has other languages in it, and I don't necessarily like trip up or anything. I just like go with the flow. So I do like things that are like, yeah, sort of like using the English language and in different ways and kind of being influenced by other languages as well.
Awesome.
Like speaking on different languages, I learnt French, and I find reading English and French quite interesting. Just even the speech patterns, being able to like visibly see them and how different they are. I feel like it's such an interesting insight into like a collective identity, especially when it's France, when it's quite homogenous. Like actually step into something that is quite personal, because there are obviously like little dialects that are so specific to some places. And I find it really interesting contrasting between just my English like language standpoint. And what books in particular or languages do you particularly seek out when you're looking at maybe like a bilingual book?
That's so interesting. I really, it must be so interesting studying French and reading French. I don't know any French. I've never learned French. But I like, a lot of, Latin writers, obviously the Spanish influence is there. A lot of like Mexican writers, Latinx writers, like I think you sort of just, it's sort of so, the Spanish speaking population in America is so big. So I think there's that kind of like tendency to just like present the book as, like not necessarily like censor it, like to be like more English. So I like that. And then, one of my favorite poets is Vietnamese. Her name's Na Nguyen, and she's based in Hanoi, Vietnam, but I read her work in translation. She's translated by her friend who's American. But, I've been able to see her read her work in the Vietnamese, and it's so beautiful. It's a very, and we had some conversations about it. It's a very like water language. Like it feels like it's very like fluid, and that kind of reminds me of Yugambeh, which is like also very kind of river-based language. And sometimes we share words for water, words that I know for water, and we're kind of like, oh, they kind of sound similar because they're of that place, that they kind of emerge from that place.
That's so interesting. One of the two of the notes I had for my questions going into this was that water and rivers crop up again and again throughout Throat as a symbol, standing for multiple themes. And one of my other questions was going to be about, I guess, the fact that it was impossible for me to understand some parts of the book because there were certain words in Yugambeh that I couldn't find translations for. And so I guess that connection between the oral sound of language and your poetry, and also water, which crops up again as a theme. What was your kind of intention with that? Because water standing for a few things I've noticed. Sorry, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah, water is life. Like, just, yeah, kind of really hard for me to like explain just how important it is to me and to, you know, everyone, I think. You know, there's a poem in the book called Water Power where I talk about how my Auntie Mel gave me like a meditation that I can do when I'm feeling stressed, which is like connecting to the water in our body, because, you know, our water, I don't know how many percent, you guys might know, is it like 80%? How much?
70% of our
70%. Our bodies are 70% water. And so we come from water, you know, and in Yugambeh, our word gumara for blood is the same word for river. And so, you know, our greeting would be to like, you know, when we greet each other, we sometimes like touch like the veins in our arm. And it's also the word for love as well. So we know that like water is the source of life, and without, you know, we need to drink a certain amount of water, and our food comes from water sources, and, you know, like, so all of this is just so important to both our like life, but also our like kind of souls as well. But also wanted to just talk about the distinction between freshwater and saltwater. And I'm a freshwater person, which means that I'm from rivers, and my country's between the Logan and Albert rivers, but pretty close to that coastline. You know, Yugambeh is also Gold Coast. So thinking about like, you know, that, yeah, the ocean as well as being yeah, I'm not a saltwater person, but we have that, you know, that influence as well. So I got a few poems about the ocean. And in terms of the Yugambeh that's in the book, some of it, you know, I worked with my cousin called Sean Davis, who's a much better language speaker than me. He's like really good. And so he and I worked on some of those. And we didn't call it translations, we called it interpretations, because there's no direct translation between the two languages. So he would read my work and then he'd be like, what about this? And like, you know, they're very specific as well. Like, you know, there's the word for grandmother, which is like, he would ask, is it your mom's mum or your dad's mum? Because they're two different words. So there's like a lot of stuff that you can just get in this word. Like, it's very contextual as well. Yeah, so I really like, I just really like that there's like different flows in the book, because it just, and I also just wanted to mention Maiwa, the Brisbane River, as being another river. So 3 rivers that have really very much influenced my life and how I move through this place. And, you know, rivers can be dangerous. You know, we've had the 2011 flood that like was hugely devastating here in Queensland. And, you know, like floods before that as well. So we need to know how to like look after these water systems, and we need to be able to like coincide living with water. And I feel like all the stories teach you that. And so, yeah, like it's just, yeah, it's really forms the geography of the place that I live in.
I found it really interesting when you said the words for grandmother are quite different. And that's the same in a lot of Scandinavian languages. My dad's from Sweden, and there are different words for all grandparents. So it's all very specific, very like categorical. And I find those, you know, similarities between languages so interesting, because they're, despite being on different hemispheres, there is that connection between language and family and connection. And I find that so amazing when it comes to just understanding other cultures, because every single culture has that skerrick of maybe like similar identity or language background.
Yeah, if you think of the Inuit, I think they have like 40 different words for snow. I mean, which is so important because they that's how they live, like. So I think that the more specific, the better. And I think Ali Kobiekouan was telling me she's from the APY lands, and she was telling me like something like 50 different words for grass. And I was like, well, that makes sense, because grass, when you say grass, that doesn't really tell you anything, So yeah, I really think those, the more specific, the better, like, and yeah, I think it's, and yeah, there's kinship words as well, to sort of be able to distinguish between your younger brother or your older brother or your dad's mum or your mum's mum, and just make things a lot more clearer, I think, when you're in conversation.
And those specific languages and dialects just show the importance of it. So the importance of snow, like it is a lifeblood for culture. It's just as grass is for your friends. And I just find like those specific things so interesting, because they tell a story of what that is important to that culture, what is pivotal to their survival. And I just find that really interesting to learn about, and especially having a conversation.
100%, Lily. Yeah, you nailed it on the head. It's so true.
And I was just to touch on the essay again, I really loved how you said our elders are living libraries. How your community has inspired your storytelling and writing.
Oh my God, yes. I'm just about to do a project with elders coming up next month, and I'm just so excited, because it's just there's so much, like I absolutely see elders as our living libraries. So they have so much story and so much knowledge, and we really need to like respect that. Unfortunately, like with like the kind of, I guess, the gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, often our people like die quite early, which is really sad. Like you start to think about like people in their like 50s as being like potentially we're going to lose them soon, which would be like the equivalent to, I think Scott Morrison made it very clear when he said people over 70, if you're non-Indigenous, stay in your house, around the COVID. If you're over 50 and you're Indigenous, stay in your house. Like there's 20 years. That's a huge difference, unfortunately. And so that makes me very, very conscious about like getting out to see my elders and like making sure like I sit with them and stuff, because and if we can record the story in some way, if we can write it down, or they can however, like I think it's like however they want to do it, but like to be able to like make sure that that's there for the next generation is like so important, because it's like a circle, like that knowledge transfer is very circular as well. And so I always see elders and young people as like the most important people to just like continue that.
And I love your mentioning of Auntie Kerry being the crested cockatoo that offers you guidance and strength in many ways when in tough times. During her life, what wisdom did she offer you that was so pivotal?
Yeah, Auntie Kerry, like an example, she was only in her 50s when she passed away, which may seem like quite young, but for me, she was like this really revered figure that just had so much knowledge and was just so senior. And now, and it's been just over a year that she passed away, and it's been a very difficult time, I think, for a lot of people that were close to her. But like I mentioned, I feel solace whenever I see a white cockatoo in the backyard, because that was her totem, Karaka. And even like my mum will like give me a feather if she finds it, and I'll just have it on my desk, because it's to remind me just to keep going. Like I was like, whoa, Auntie Kerry was like did so many things, she was involved in so many ways, and particularly in literature, she was really spearheaded like Black literature, and she created this organization called First Nations Australian Writers Network, which you guys can connect. You can look up FNAWN for Norn, as we call it for short. it was just a way to kind of mobilize all of the great literature that was going on around the country, and just be like, hey, we're here. And through Auntie Kerry's leadership, we went to America in, I think, 2016, and I did a reading at the New York Poetry House, and we had all these great beautiful things that we got to connect with an American audience. And she was really about us taking our literature to the global stage. And so, yeah, we continue that fight. And, it makes me think, whenever I'm feeling like lazy or lethargic, I'm like, I can keep going, and I can, she did so many things, and she was so sick for so long, but she kept going, so I can keep going.
It's really beautiful. With losing family members is very difficult, especially in a community where they are so pivotal. It's like, for me, it reminds me of the pride of elephants, because of their elders are so revered and important. And I just feel like those connections between animals as well and their importance very pivotal for so many cultures.
Yeah, totally, absolutely.
Alrighty.
Looking at my notes because I've completely lost where I am. What key novels and poems have shaped, like, maybe, I really like how they've structured that, or that use of what really, like, influences you in your writing?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and just off the top of my head, I just read a poem by this poet called Franny Choi, who's a Korean American poet, and she wrote a poem about, let's say, 5 years ago, and it's kind of about, like, if we lived in a world with no police. And, like, I was like, wow, that's really it was really great to revisit that poem, like, during this Black Lives Matter, how much attention has been to how corrupt police are throughout the world, and how violent and how murderous some of those systems are, and can we imagine a different way? And so, like, she, in the poem, like, I love narrative poetry, so she illustrates the story of students going to a museum, and they're like, they've seen, they've never grown up with police, so like, oh wow, this used to happen, people were okay with this. And so it's like a really interesting, it's like a futuristic poem, like reimagining this different scenario. And it's like very interesting, I think, for the reader to start being like, oh yeah, I wonder what would that be like. And I wish I had the poem to quote from it, but yeah, it's a really, really interesting poem. Like, yeah. And so I influenced by, I guess at the moment I'm very influenced by speculative poetry or futuristic poetry that's like using, the very popular futuristic genre and speculative fiction genre, but using it in poetry and being able to, like, create new worlds through poetry, and people just being like, yeah, I can go with this. Like, yeah, so I'm really enjoying that at the moment.
I have so many more things I kind of want to ask, but we are moving towards the end of the interview now, I think in a few minutes. So is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, not really. Like, you guys have talked me out. You guys have been so quick with your questions. Thank you so much for, like, reading my work so carefully, and really getting me to, like, think and respond to your really thoughtful questions. And yeah, we could keep going if we didn't have that time constraint.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd just like to thank you so much for joining us today it's a pretty weird world at the moment, and thank you for joining us in Yugambeh country as well, and as we sit on Naarm specifically in the Wurundjeri
Wurundjeri country. Yeah.
Same with me.
Yeah, same.
Paying respects.
Thank you very
Elders past, present, future. Anyway, I do think we have to get off now. So thank you so much for joining us, Ellen. And thank you everyone viewing for tuning in.
Thank you. Just want to say thanks to Albert Park College and say hi to everybody, and very much thank you, Lily,